Hello.
Hey,
Hi, how you
so
doing?
what's your name? Is it Jamuna?
Oh my God, you got it right. Yes, it's
Okay.
Simona.
Okay, I'm Bronson. Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you too.
So where do you live? Do you live in America or?
Yes, yes. I'm
Okay,
here. I'm
cool.
studying here, so I live in America currently, but I'm from Nepal.
Nepal. Okay, cool. I actually knew two girls from Nepal.
Hmm.
Um, so I believe in open borders. I guess you must have watched my last debate. Maybe you did not.
Hmm.
The case for me is kind of simple. I apply libertarian logic to all things, basically.
Hmm.
And that is to say that third parties really don't have a say in the actions of two voluntary consenting adults or more. That
Hmm.
is to say, if I and some other consenting adult agree to some kind of arrangement, there's a strong presumption upon a against a third party having any say in the matter whatsoever.
Hmm.
And so I apply that logic to basically anything: gay marriage, drugs, or immigration.
Okay. Um, what I believe is that if like when you said like the decision of two consenting adults like cannot be affected by the third party, I think if in case the third party is actually a part of the society itself, like I mean, if they are actually affected by the action in some way, or there are possibilities or potential of them being affected by the action in some ways, I think it should be considered, and it should not just be the decision, like as you said. I mean, it would not be okay even if it's the two consenting adults who are okay with it, because there is a larger section of the audience who is also who is also kind of like affected by it. So that is what I believe, and I think. Yeah, in terms of open borders, like I actually do not support open borders because I think there are a lot of things that comes with it, and I think it is a very like it is a bad policy because like there are a lot of things like that will be affected by open border policy, like So I'll just be talking about those things in my debate, like how there will be a race to the bottom for the country itself, how there will be a limit in the cultural identity of the people already living there. And I think it, in fact, will kind of like backfire the economy of the country itself. So those are the kind of things I'll be talking about in my debate. So yeah, I think you could move ahead and present your case first.
Okay. Well, that basically is my case. So I guess we could get into like the economics and the specifics of it. I would preface by saying that I'm an anarchist, so any kind of appeal to patriotism or nationalism is likely not going to persuade me. Um, I am very open to any kind of economic argument. If the evidence shows that, then sure, I won't dispute it. But in terms of the idea that I should give preference to, I don't know, someone in Compton over someone like you from Nepal, I categorically reject that I have any kind of patriotic duty to favor them over you or some any other immigrant, for example. So I would actually give you the ball and put it in your court.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Uh, okay, let me just dive into the thing that. All right, so I'll just give you like a kind of a kind of status quo that open borders would actually bring. So open borders, like explaining it, it's just a policy of unlimited or free migration. There's no control on the flow, and that's what happens. So if you are actually, let's suppose, like if you are poor and your country actually provides no social safety net, you move to the one that does. And like if in case, like when you are being progressive or maybe like going for the better option, that seems like a good thing. And if you are rich and your country makes you pay your taxes, you move to the one that does not. So the safety nets, the public goods in general, because now that what happens to them is that they disappear, like is they become both overloaded and underfunded. So like as I said, like do different cases your country does not provide you no, a good social safety net, you move to the other. So the place you move in, it will be facing overload. And the place where like in the case where your country makes you pay more taxes and then you move into the other. So now what happens in that case is that the country becomes underfunded. So that is what happens to the world without borders. And if you see that community, so this is actually the tragedy that comes with the open access to the borders. Now, if people are actually allowed, like, to get into the borders, to get into open borders, there is, in principle, no limit to how many could come. So now if you see what happens after that is that even if the country, okay, even if there's a country A and there are people coming into the country, so there will be some constraints. So how many new jobs can be created over the short term, or maybe how many apartments can be built for the same person to be sustained. So there are always so many constraints existing if there's an overflow of people that happens in like any countries. So that will actually be, I mean, if in case someone is doing that for a good purpose, someone is actually getting into the border for a good purpose, it's actually defeating the principle itself, because as I said, there will be constraints. And yeah, the country itself will be facing problems because there is an overload on them um, as well. And
Okay.
mhm.
Okay, so this is actually basically the most common argument against open borders is that essentially it's bad for the welfare state in particular, but that can also be wrapped into the state. Um, Given that I am an anarcho-capitalist, I don't believe in the welfare state to begin with. So for me, it's not actually a problem that this causes problems with the welfare state. So if, for example, it does lead to overload and collapse, to me, that's actually a good outcome. I don't think there should be a welfare state. In terms of people not having jobs or places to stay, we just have to go back with my original argument, which is that in the case of economics, we're talking about a situation where people do have somewhere to stay and they are working somewhere because there's no one else there to take care of them,
Okay, I know.
except some kind of
Uh-huh.
private charity, I suppose. I don't know, but yeah, you generally have to have something to do, or you have to have some way to put food in your mouth and a roof over your head.
But like, when you say, like, when you talk about open border policy, and when I tell you that this is a kind of principle where there's like you don't have any limit, you don't have actually like any no restrictions on the moment. So I mean, like, how can you assure that like everyone who comes is actually going to have a place to stay? Like, and then as I said, open border is a free movement. So you cannot actually limit this to the idea that people, only those people who actually will have a place to stay or maybe a place to work will be coming in. Because I think this is a kind of wrong limitation you're putting on the like open border itself, because as it comes with the idea of no restrictions or movement, you cannot actually insert every one of those people to actually like, have somewhere to stay or maybe like have a place to work in. So I don't know. I don't actually favor this limitation we are proposing because
Okay.
uh-huh.
I'm happy to explain. So it's not actually the state that would be imposing these limitations. It would actually be economics. From all the data we can gather, all the evidence shows that immigration is in fact related to economics mostly. I mean, obviously, someone fleeing a dictator or something, but that could also be considered economics too. So in fact, if the economy is growing, that's likely to increase immigration. And when the economy is not going, for example, when there are no jobs to go to, immigration is reduced. So it seems unlikely that someone would, risk everything and, use their entire life savings to come to America with nothing to do there. Like, why would you come to America to be homeless, for example?
Mm-hmm. Okay. Like I think you are just, I mean, in case of like people trying getting into the open border, I think you are just keeping your argument to some kind of people who are actually being progressive or who actually want to move, like, maybe do a better earning job than what the previous one is. But you are actually not considering the cases of people. Like, there are so many different cases. Like, someone would actually maybe like come to America because or maybe America, or maybe even other countries, like, because they don't, I mean, like, even despite being this, even the fact that it maybe, like, it could be different cases, like, I mean, um I'm not exactly getting the word right here, but some people who don't have like,
Okay, so
uh-huh, yeah, you could just go ahead.
okay, there there are in fact some people
Hmm.
who can't find jobs or housing or whatever, right?
Hmm.
That's the basic argument.
Hmm.
Okay, well, what I would say to that is that these are probably going to be a small percentage of the total immigrating population.
Hmm.
Because what we know about immigration is that it's based on economics. When the economy is growing and there are jobs, we have more. And when the economy is not growing and there are no jobs, we have less immigration. And that has nothing at all to do with immigration policy, which basically hasn't changed within those periods.
Okay. Can you actually dive into that principally, because like you're actually talking about evidence that if in case there's like, I mean there's the jobs and all, there's like higher increase in economy, or like higher increase in immigration and all. Like, yeah, well, if you could dive into that principally, like how actually that happens.
Yeah, so people are obviously attracted to, a better life in general. This is pretty much a universal concept.
Mm-hmm.
It's one reason why you don't see massive immigration from the United States into Mexico,
Mm-hmm.
or other places like that, because that would be going down, and everyone's trying to go up for the most part.
Mm-hmm.
So, for example, in the United States, when the economy is booming and there are jobs, you are likely to encounter more immigration. And when that's not the case, you are likely to have less immigration, and the evidence demonstrates this.
Okay, so in case of Okay, so in case of this debate, like when we are talking about like why when you are talking about like why open borders is good, like, I mean, I don't actually see the link here, because what you are telling is that if in case there are more jobs, there's more immigration. So
Mm-hmm.
there's more immigration. So, I mean, is that why you support open borders? Like, because I mean,
No,
you know,
well, that was to your specific argument that we would have this massive influx of people who with no jobs and no place to live.
mhm.
That seems like an unlikely scenario because it didn't happen. Um,
Okay, okay.
it,
So in that case, my point was not that, like, my point was not that if in case immigrants come into America, maybe my point was not that Americans might be losing jobs. My point was that there would be people like who would actually be coming, like those people, like, who would be coming and they would not have jobs. Like, that's my argument. I mean, I'm not saying that Americans would lose jobs because of immigrants. My question is that those people who are coming as immigrants would not have jobs, and that's my question. And what you are suggesting is that if in case there are more jobs, like there will be more immigration. So that's what I'm exactly telling, like, because if the country is facing overloading, there could be less jobs. Like, there could be less, I mean, yeah, because if there's an overload, the country might not actually be acceptable, or may actually be adjustable to those kind of different changes, like sudden overloading. So that's why there will be less jobs, and that is actually just going back. So that's what I meant.
yeah, so my response to that is simply that that's going to be a small number of the total immigrant population. You will have some people, I guess, who aren't able to find jobs or housing or whatever the issue is, but they are going to be a small minority within the immigrant population, and thus it's still net positive that we have more immigration. On top of that, we know that simply having more people in a country creates more jobs. There's Immigrants do not just
Mhm.
produce. I mean, production is probably the primary reason why we should support open borders, but it's not just that. It's kind of like it's a issue that helps itself in that they don't only produce, they also consume things, which then creates even more jobs.
Mm-hmm.
right? So as far as I can tell, I've looked at some of the literature, and I think the best estimates of what would happen if every country just went open borders, purely from an economic perspective, is that um, world GDP would at least double. The range is something like 67% to 140 something percent. But I suppose that there one, doubling is a good number. So yeah, the production is the main reason why we should everyone should support open borders because we'd all be richer.
Okay. So, okay, just let me just explain to you in terms of um okay, in this case here, like, so if in case the borders are completely open and it's near costless to immigrate from one country to the other, like, so as I even said, like, then the country with the which you actually identified, but still, like, I'd like to talk more about it because so the country with best social services and benefits will draw the world's poorest people and creating a strong adverse selection effect. That country will quickly lose its ability to fund those services and like they'll be significantly downscaled. Like when you tell me like in the economy would actually prosper, like for the if in case you see the quick one, maybe the immediate impact of that will actually be different because they will be significantly downskilled in terms of not being able to fund those people as well. And when you tell me that, like, I think you do ignore a lot of, like, you do ignore the fraction of people those will be coming like for different reasons to America or maybe to other countries, like, so despite the fact that you were saying that it could be a small percentage, like the small percentage itself, like, could, I mean, the you can never define like what constitutes a threat, like, it can always be debated. So I mean, someone with a criminal record, or like if in case you see someone who carries an infectious disease as well, represents a direct physical threat. So one, like, who directly or like, indirectly seeks to like be in the country, if you see like even that small mass of small percentage could actually represent a threat to the nation itself. And the fact that the presumption of, like, presumption of a better life with respect to immigrants, I think is a violation of the principle of self-defense um for the same reasons, because like, it's just not fair to the people as well living in the country.
Okay,
Mm-hmm.
I get it. I got your basic argument. My response to that is that it's basically an exaggerated threat. Yeah, there is some risk involved, but the same could be said about allowing people to immigrate, within the country and move around. It presents all the same risks. And yeah, I don't think it's that big of a deal. To give you an example, a common argument I find, well, what about Al Qaeda or ISIS? What if we just let them in? Well, based on the evidence, that doesn't seem to be really that big of a deal or that big of a problem because it hasn't happened. The border with Mexico is essentially open.
Uh-huh.
Not well, Canada is for sure, and there's no real rational explanation for why this hasn't happened yet. Why aren't we having a large numbers of Muslim terrorists? Illegally. Why wouldn't they just fly to Mexico and come to America and blow up buildings? That to me that indicates that it's probably not as a big a problem as it's imagined to be.
Mm-hmm. So, but still, like the fact that it hasn't happened does not necessarily, as I said, like that's an evidence. But if you deal it principally, there could always be a possibility of this happening. So the fact that it has not happened does not keep you away from the possibility that it could happen. And I think,
No, I admit that there is a risk. So it is of course possible.
mhm,
But once again, I'm not arguing in terms of absolutes. I'm saying how big is the risk? How big is the threat?
mhm,
And what is the evidence? And
mhm.
apparently not that big of a deal.
Okay, I think as I said again, like I think that's highly based on what has happened. The fact that, like, open border has always been a threat, like, to, I mean, there's always an existing kind of, like, national threat, I mean, threat to security and public safety to everyone. And the fact,
Wait, but so
uh,
real quickly, do we actually have any evidence of Islamic terrorists immigrating here illegally and then committing terrorist acts? Is that like a thing? I don't know. I've never heard of that,
mhm.
but what would you say?
Okay. It's in this case, like I think, I mean, I'm not actually someone who looks like, who actually talks about so much about evidence, but in this case, like I think if in case I mean, I want like, this to be dealt principally because I mean, evidence is like as I said, like some event happening, I think that this could never actually take you away from the possibility that it could happen. So the fact that what you were saying is that since it has not happened, this is not much big of a threat. So that's what I
Yeah.
disagree to, because the fact that it has not happened does not mean that it is less of a threat, you know. And if you see like,
Well, it kind of does.
mhm,
Let me explain briefly. So, most humans are
mhm,
irrational.
mhm,
To give you an example, most people think flying is a greater threat than driving to the airport, even
mhm,
though the evidence clearly shows that is not true. That
mhm,
is not the case. Flying is much safer than driving to the airport. However, we still perceive the threat of flying to be much greater than it actually is.
mhm,
Now, this is not to say that the plane absolutely will not crash,
mhm,
just that the threat is largely imaginary and over exaggerated.
mhm. Okay, but
So, yeah, that's
okay. So and okay, I still like do disagree to that because um let me just give you an example. I just kept my okay. Or I'll be back to the example of this. But the thing is that like despite when you say this is okay, I'll just okay, I'm just getting back to the point. All right.
Oh, take your time.
Oh, you could, yeah,
Actually,
you could take your time first. You
I,
could just say something else. I'll be back to this. Yeah.
I'm just looking at the time and I really have to use the bathroom. So I'm wondering if that would be like rude. I don't know how this works, but
No, you could just go ahead.
it'll take a minute. And then you can gather your what you're looking at. So I'll be right back.
Yeah, okay.
Okay, sorry about that. I'm gonna make a note of using the bathroom before I start speaking.
Okay, so when you like just talked about you asked me the evidence of immigration actually being a problem, like I just found a case like regarding Islamic immigration and crime in Europe. So it is actually in terms of the rape statistics that is existing in Europe, what is happening is that there is a considerable fraction of stranger rapes that are actually being carried out by like the Muslim immigrants and children of immigrants. And like I would have actually specifically like gone into these things, but because I didn't have, as I said, like I don't go so much into the evidence, I didn't actually got through like a detailed case study of this. But
Okay, so
uh-huh,
rape is on the up in Europe,
uh-huh.
right? In like where Muslim migration. Okay.
Hmm. And there's that existing like assault, gang rapes in Sweden, and rape jihad in Sweden as well, and immigrant rape in Sweden. In fact, like most parts of the Sweden. So, um,
Wait, really
mhm,
quickly, just I don't want. So I've been actually unable to find reliable sources that are actually counting the number of rapes.
mhm, mhm,
What I tend to find is, you know, many anecdotal anecdotal accounts of this actually happening. In general, it's safe to say that what's going on the news is not generally an accurate picture of what's going on in the world,
mhm,
just because things that are unusual tend to make the news, right? So, if you can imagine, uh, if someone is being raped, that's kind of a somewhat rare
Mhm.
occurrence, but it will make the news. And in the day of the internet, that will be basically a daily occurrence.
Uh-huh. So
So
yes,
do you have reliable
yes.
evidence? Like, is there like government
Uh-huh.
sources or?
I'll actually,
Okay,
yeah,
I'll
I'll
listen.
actually post it down so that you can actually go through it. So the thing is that I think in terms of like going through this and what you're suggesting is that even in case of rape, like what you're suggesting is that it is if in case I go through your back like the points of your previous arguments, that is there's just a small fraction that is actually like happening. So it's more like you say that since there is a better prospect that is existing, even though this small fraction is happening, that is where like, it is good. So as I said, like in sensitive cases like this, I mean, even though it's a small fraction that is actually happening, we should not like when you yourself actually consider the fact that you talk about liberty and everything that you talked about it like in the front page of the debate itself. So when you talk about it like which is a personal trait to the person itself, the person's body, and then I think even though this is a small fraction of it, we should be highly considerable, or maybe like or maybe we should be actually thinking more about it. And I think like in terms of I'll just explain it more properly how like immigration could actually maybe be like be like result in more crimes, because if you see the conditions of people working as an immigrant in America or like in anywhere, it's actually difficult and it's actually different, like so what that could actually cause is that because that is happening, that could actually result in more crimes as well, because the way they are actually treated, or the way actually they are like differed from the other people, like in terms of their job facilities, or maybe in terms of their job opportunities, or the way they are treated. I think, in fact, that could also be a bigger result for them to actually commit crimes in the country. So, like, if you see, like, there's always like, even if there is more employment existing in the country, that could also actually bring much threat to the citizens itself, or maybe much threat to the like in the community in general. So, what do you say about that?
Well, there's a few points I would make here. One, immigration policy in Europe is a bit different from America because I believe in general the nation state in European countries tends to do things that actually protect bad behavior, such as rape or things going on in Muslim communities. So I think that in the absence of these, policies that the government enacts, I think there would be probably be less tolerance for that kind of shit in general. I think worst case scenario, the people grab their pitchforks and start burning down mosques. But I'm saying it probably would never even come to that because people in general would be intolerant of that kind of behavior. The second point I would make it relates just to my overall general worldview is that I tend to talk less in terms of morality and more in numbers. I think numbers are plainer, they're less open to interpretation. I think that when we examine things at a larger scale, like let's take a plane, riding on an airplane, for example, yes, at the micro level, it may seem quite scary until you take into the fact, if you look at the larger number, if you zoom out for a second, you see that actually this is actually quite rare and this is not really what's going on. In general, immigrants are simply coming here, working their jobs, paying their taxes, and their kids are assimilating and integrating, as has always been the case throughout history.
Mm-hmm. Uh, okay. All right. So I'll talk about the next thing. What happens with this kind of immigrants? So if in case let's assume like um everyone could enter the country. So that means a lot of things. Now that also means that they can be sent back if they are apprehended, maybe fined and imprisoned. All their belongings might be confiscated, and and there is just that they have a lack of security and they cannot make actually dependable plans over the long term. So now what happens with this is that like there's always an ongoing threat that exists to those kind of immigrants as well. So not just like if in case let's just imagine uh like like certain the same condition, like if in case one has a family here, like one is doing good, but if in case the person is sent back or maybe fined and imprisoned, like and get back to the other country, to their previous country or so, without the ties that is existing with the current family, the family who is existing here, I mean, even in terms of like society, like, family, all these things will be disrupted if in case you see, like, so there is no long-term or maybe dependable plans, like if in case there's an immigrant coming in. So there's belongings, there, like, there plans. I don't like there is an existing threat for the people themselves as well, like even in terms of economical condition in their like work, or maybe in terms of their families, communities. There's always like those kind of constraints existing for those kind of people as well. It's not just the benefit like you were highlighting that comes through open borders. I think there should be like you should also consider those kind of threats that are actually existing. I mean, just the fact that they are getting good jobs, or they're like they are actually, they could
No,
be
no.
the, just an assumption that they could be doing good here, like is not a sufficient
Well,
reason.
it's not an assumption. It's really
Okay.
not an
Uh-huh.
assumption because
Uh-huh.
I'm talking about what the evidence shows. It's not that I'm not taking into account these
Uh-huh.
threats and negative externalities. I'm simply saying that the positives outweigh by an order of magnitude, in my opinion.
Uh-huh. But still,
Because
like, why
most
what
immigrants are not
why does it have to be that
criminals.
way? Why does it have to be that way? Because if in case you're telling me that like okay, 80% of the 80% of the citizens are being benefited, like how can you actually disregard these 20% of the citizens that are being disbenefited? While you talk about liberty, while you talk about like those kind of things already, like how can you actually not consider those 20% of the citizens who are being disbenefited by the same thing? That is my
Okay,
point. Uh-huh.
I have an answer to that.
Mm-hmm.
So, I would say that in general, I kind of think like an economist. I just know that the universe was created in such a way that it exists in the state of probabilities and spectrums rather than absolutes. So I just happen to know that any policy or any immigration of any kind is, in fact, going to negatively affect someone. We can simply presume that because it's just a fact, right? What the real question is it a net negative or is it a net positive? And for me, that has a very simple and straightforward answer. It's net positive. To give you another example, there are negative consequences to having a democracy, or there's some people do not benefit from liberty. Some people are not going to benefit from this arrangement. However, society as a whole will.
Mm-hmm.
And yes, some people are really gonna not, like, let's say you're a low skilled
Mm-hmm.
worker who decided not to graduate high school,
Mm-hmm.
and now you find yourself competing with some
Mm-hmm.
immigrant. Yeah, it sucks for you, but society in general will be better off.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So that's why I say things in terms of like probabilities and numbers, because that's just the way I think in general.
Mm-hmm. Okay. All right. So, yeah. But while it seems like while I'm actually trying to consider the case of like, I mean, as in general, or maybe like all the percentage, you are actually considering the higher. It's talking about the net positive. Uh,
Yeah.
okay. Yes, but still,
Because I mean that would be true of any policy, right? You have to assume that literally any policy is going to have some kind of negative effect on some undefined amount of people, right? No
yes,
matter what the policy is. So
uh,
then,
uh-huh. But the
well,
problem.
so then would apply to immigration.
Okay, like in all right. So as I said, like in this case, when you are considering the 20% way, when you are actually talking about the net positive, like the problem with this and other policies are different if you see it, because like I mean it's not just a single. I mean it's not just a, like like people are maybe being disbenefited by like some tax policies or like some kind of things. It's so big in general. If you see, it's a kind of like it's a kind of threat. I mean, it's a I mean, it's a threat to the body itself. It's a threat to security and public safety, which is not small. So that is what
Hypothetical.
I that is what I'm trying to differentiate. I mean, if in case in other policies, like people do consider the fact of net positive, that's fine. But in this case, there's a larger thing that is at stake, and that's why I do not agree to the net positive we are considering in this debate, because as I said, like I talked about those kind of like the rapist statistics as well, and which I will definitely like put the link on the debate, yeah, the comment itself, in which you can
Okay.
actually look through. And those kind of
Okay.
threat to people, to human body, like I mean, those are the kind of threats that cannot be accepted, even though there is a net positive existing. Because now, um, yes, as I said, like when I mean, in terms of um safety,
Wait,
in
wait.
terms of uh-huh.
Oh wait. So just going back to Europe and the Muslim migration there, is the only way we could deal with the threat of rape restricting immigration? For example, can we arm communities? Can we step up policing, things like that? Like what? Why would we presume that denying all the immigrants because of the actions of a few would be the better policy because this threat is so great?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay.
Right? What if we had some other solution? Like, what if we just simply armed these communities or, surrounding communities? Or let's say that, okay, from now on, if you're walking through a Muslim neighborhood, you have the right to carry a gun on your hip or something.
Okay, look at this. Like, if in case you look at this, which of these solutions seems more feasible to you? Arming every like citizen of the country, or like restricting one single border that that actually allows restricting the policy of open border. If you see the solution, like even in terms of these solutions, even if in case you like see how the country can contribute in these two kind of solutions, the country will much easier be like country will be much easily handling this solution, which is restricting the open border. I agree, like the solutions you're presenting is this, but still the solution that I present to you is that restricting the open borders is much feasible to the country itself. So that is my point. It's much feasible, it's much easier, and it's much cheaper to the country itself, if in case they do it, rather than arming the entire citizen of the country. That is much feasible.
Well, that was one solution. I also discussed policing, for example. That doesn't seem unfeasible to me to just simply step up enforcement in those areas.
And those areas isn't like
Yeah, the Muslim, whatever, the Muslim areas, right?
okay, like in this case, like
The
so
rape,
this
wherever the rape areas are.
I mean, how do you know it? That how do you know it? Like, and how does anyone actually like I mean, the rape area, or I mean, I don't know, that can be like limited to this place. Like maybe this things happen in this case, it could just happen anywhere. And the fact is that the rape cases and everything that is happening, despite there are polices there are polices looking after all these things, but still, why is that happening? So the problem is not like there is no government regulating it. There is already country regulating the police, or maybe like security people everywhere, but still it is still happening. Like so that is the case. So that is not the solution here. So because this is already happening, and despite that kind of like security the country has provided, the
Well,
cases are still happening.
Well, then I would have to go back to how big is the actual threat? What do the numbers say? What is the total number of immigrants versus the total number of immigrants who are raping
Mhm.
people? And in that way, we can determine whether or not it's a good policy rather than, going strictly by our emotional states and saying, well, rape is bad, so let's cut off all the immigrants. To give you an example, let's presume that it were true that blacks rape white blacks rape women more often, statistically more often, let's say, than any other group. Would that then justify discriminating against the entire population? Because I mean that's millions and millions of people, and we're trying to basically harm them because
Uh,
a small amount of
okay.
other black rapists exists, and rape is such a threat that this is morally justified.
Did you say like if in case we restrict the whole black population, if in case one case happens, did you like I mean
Not arrested, just well, I'm trying to think of something that would be analogous to not allowing someone to even be in the country. Like, what, maybe we
Okay,
had job
okay.
restrictions for
Okay.
blacks. I don't know.
In that case, like, so restricting the open flow of movements. So open borders is all about restricting the open flow of movements. So open flow, like, of like migrating here and there. But that does not actually, like, that is not actually rejecting the fact that there could be, like, there are existing policies that actually do, like, you can actually enter the country through, like, through the policy, through actually, like, the papers and everything that still exists, like, so there should be a background check, there should be a security check, and if in case that's how people enter, that's completely fine. That's not what I'm rejecting. So if in case that is happening, there should, that's something I completely accept. So that is something I am proposing, but my problem is with the open borders where there is no security check, there is no restriction on the movement of people, on the flow of people. So that is my problem. I'm not actually telling you that, like, every immigrant should not be allowed to come. That is not my point. That is not my point. My point is that when there is no background check, when
Right.
there is open free of movement, then that is the problem. That is my problem. So I'm not actually rejecting
Well,
that.
I'm talking specifically about either the illegal immigrants or the refugees who don't jump through the hoops as you described with all the checks or whatnot. So when I say immigrants, that I am talking about, we are talking about the same group of people.
Mm-hmm.
So even within that group of people,
Mm-hmm.
rapists certainly constitute a tiny minority of that group.
Mm-hmm.
And so once again, I would have to say, is the threat actually big enough to justify discriminating against all those people?
Mm-hmm. Um, for me, yes, definitely, because as I said, the threat is not actually about lowering someone's living standard, or it's not about actually, like, maybe affecting them in a small level, like, rape, if in case if you see itself, like, my problem with my idea on this is that it's a big threat. Like, even though it's a certain, like, it's a less percentage of people like facing this kind of threat, and the fact is that this is a big threat because this is a threat to life itself. This is a threat to dignity, to, like, security, public safety, and that is what my case stands for. So um,
Okay.
if in case,
Well,
like, someone is actually possessing a threat to their life, to actually their security and to the dignity, I think in that case, like, it should definitely be considered. It should definitely be considered. And, like, if you see, like, there are three major stakeholders in this debate: the country which the people are migrating to, and in fact, there are four stakeholders: the country which they are migrating to, the people in the country which they are migrating to, and the immigrants itself. Now, as I told you, like, how the country itself from which they're migrating to would be underfunded by this case. I'm just going to, like, wrap up everything here, and then you can move on. And then the country which they'll be moving to will be overcrowded, like, overloaded as well. And there will be existing threat that will be always existing to the citizens of the country, because, as I said, there will be poor economic conditions for the people who are immigrating. Their productivity will be, like, very less, even, like, in terms of that. And even that can actually result to some criminal activities, like, resulting in, like, oppression from those kind of people, which is now again posing threat to the citizens always already living there, and also to the other immigrants who are living there as well. It's not just on the like, citizens who are the stakeholders in this case. So it's just not benefiting. It's not just, if in case, even if you, like, were looking at the larger good, it's not what exactly is happening. And there are, like, countries, or there are places that is actually possessing bigger threat, and since there could be, like, threat, as I said, maybe infectious disease as well. If you see infectious disease, or maybe, like, rape cases, or anything, like, these are a kind of threat that actually could pose a threat to life, and which is very valuable, and which is something I could actually consider, like, even disregarding the net positive you actually are proposing. Yeah, that's my case here. You can just wrap
okay.
up.
Okay, got it. So I would say that what you're actually describing is a potential threat, not an actual threat. And I would describe it as largely an emotional argument, in that, yes, flying is scary and nobody wants to get in the plane crash, in the same way that nobody wants to get raped. However, the only way to actually calculate that risk, which is called actuarial science, is by looking at the actual numbers. How many people are being raped? What is that in relation to the total number of the people that we want to stop from coming? To give you an analogy that may or may not fit, let's say it was absolutely true that blacks happen to rape women at a much higher rate than other groups. Would this then justify certain policies such as restricting giving blacks a curfew, because rape is such a big threat that anything at all that we do to reduce rape could be considered morally justified. So let's say giving curfews for black people, doing special record checks because they are statistically more likely to engage in rape. And I would argue that's morally indefensible for the same reason. Well, immigration is morally indefensible